We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Well, you remember that speech. It's where Donald Trump told a crowd that had gathered there in the nation's capital not to give up, even as he falsely called the 2020 election stolen. He's now facing his third indictment, though, this one in connection with the January 6th riot at the Capitol.
And here's a look at the 4 charges the grand jury handed up yesterday. Conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. Robert Costa kicks off our coverage from Capitol Hill. Bob, good morning.
Morning. Good to be with you. Here in Washington, former President Donald Trump faces a legal and political reckoning, and his campaign is pushing back hard against these latest charges, comparing the Justice Department to the Soviet Union and other authoritarian regimes. But inside Trump's orbit, many allies are on edge, especially about former Vice President Mike Pence emerging as a key witness in this indictment.
Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States.
In a historic indictment, special counsel Jack Smith charged former President Donald Trump for his alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election and stoke a crisis in American democracy.
As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government.
The 45-page indictment listed 6 unnamed and uncharged co-conspirators. Sources close to the investigation say the indictment suggests that lawyers Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Sidney Powell, as well as former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark could be the potential co-conspirators, though the special counsel has not confirmed the identities.
That was a rigged election, but we're still fighting it.
The special counsel laid out the case that Trump knowingly spread lies about the election, despite repeatedly being told his claims of fraud were false, including by his own attorney general after the election.
I told him that the stuff that his people were shoveling out to the public were that the claims of fraud were.
The special counsel accuses Trump of orchestrating a plan to overturn the 2020 election results by organizing fake electors in 7 targeted states in which he lost, and pressured state officials, including Georgia Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger.
I just want to find 11,780 votes.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
The special counsel also makes the case the former president directed his supporters to go to the Capitol on January 6, while Congress was in the process of certifying the election.
And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Trump has denied any wrongdoing and in a statement Tuesday called the indictment disgraceful and unprecedented political targeting. Sources tell CBS News former President Trump's legal team is now mapping out a new strategy to push back on the charges, shifting blame onto lawyers like John Eastman, who were advising him at the time. According to the indictment, Eastman pressured then Vice President Mike Pence not to formally certify the 2020 election results and presented Trump with a plan on how to do so.
All we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this.
Pence, in a statement Tuesday, said today's indictment serves as an important reminder. Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States.
Former President Trump is expected to be here in Washington on Thursday at 4 p.m. sharp for his first appearance in federal court in this case. Meanwhile, some of his allies and their lawyers have been issuing statements about this indictment. John Eastman's attorney said, quote, "The indictment relies on a misleading presentation of the record, and if Eastman is indicted, he will go to trial." Giuliani's lawyer said this indictment, quote, "eviscerates the First Amendment, and every fact Giuliani possesses about this case establishes the good faith basis President Donald Trump had for the actions he took." Meanwhile, over at the White House, spokespeople for President Biden have declined to comment. Anne-Marie.
All right, Bob, thank you. So for more on this indictment, I want to bring in CBS News investigative reporter Graham Cates. So, Graham, you heard in Bob's story a portion of the former vice president's response to this indictment, a much stronger statement than any of the other 2024 candidates. One of the elements of this conspiracy that is outlined in the indictment has to do with putting pressure on Mike Pence not to certify the election. How dangerous is the former vice president's testimony and what the former vice president has to say? How dangerous is this for Trump's defense?
One thing that's clear is that former Vice President Mike Pence may be a key witness moving forward against former President Trump. And one of the reasons for that is because it details personal conversations that they had, Trump and Pence one-on-one, Trump saying to other people, I'm going to be the one to talk to Vice President Pence and talk to him about this plan. And so if Mike Pence testifies to those personal conversations, we really don't know how that's going to affect former President Trump's case, but it could be severe.
So in the indictment, the president is the only one who's facing any charges, but there are 6 unindicted co-conspirators. We know that most of them are attorneys. Their names aren't there, but, immediately a guessing game was started as to who they may be because there's some identifiable clues.
Yeah, that's right. And at this point, it's pretty clear. So co-conspirator number 1 appears to be Rudy Giuliani. His own attorney has acknowledged that. And there's some key moments in there that, are kind of undeniable. There's a quote from a former Arizona state legislator speaker talking about co-conspirator 1 saying, we don't have any evidence yet, but we have a lot of theories about voter fraud. And that matches up very, very closely with what Rusty Bowers, the former speaker, said during his January 6th committee testimony. So there are things where you kind of go, yes, they're not naming this person, but it's hard to deny that person's Rudy Giuliani, and that person spearheaded, according to the prosecutors, this campaign to thwart the election.
One of the things that we've heard from the former president and his attorneys is that he was taking the advice of his own attorneys. Is there a concern within the Trump camp that any of these co-conspirators, some of them attorneys for the former president, that they may cooperate with the prosecution?
Yeah, look, they're threading a fine needle, right? I mean, these are people who are ostensibly Trump allies through thick and thin. That's the whole point of it. But they're not indicted. They're co-conspirators. They could in the future be indicted potentially. So if he's going to blame them, it's going to be a really fine line to walk.
And can we talk a little bit about the judge who's going to preside over this case? The judge has overseen a case of Trump's before. What do we know about her and some of what she said in the past?
Sure. She's been involved in several January 6th related cases, as well as some decisions related to Trump. And she's been tough on January 6th defendants, giving them severe sentences when she addresses them during sentencing. She has expressed kind of really, really serious dismay for what happened on January 6th. And she's also said, the president isn't above the law. She's been tough on President Trump already. So this is definitely going to be a matter of concern for him.
All right, Graham Cates, thank you. We're going to get right into some legal analysis now of this new indictment. We're joined by former federal prosecutor Scott Fredericksen. Thank you so much for joining us, Scott. Out of the 4 charges that the former president faces, which ones do you think are the most serious? And could any of them prevent him from running from office?
Well, taking your last question last, none of the charges, even if he's convicted, would prevent him from running for office. There's nothing in the Constitution that prevents that. Each of these charges are equally serious, but in the end, it boils down to a conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate results of the election, if that is proven. So each of the charges are equally serious in all respects.
So one of Donald Trump's attorneys was on CBS Mornings earlier today. I want to play a little bit of the sound. The attorney was asked about Donald Trump's decision to publicly call out or question the legitimacy of the election. Let's play that.
To still say it
have
was.
The smoking gun of innocence.
The
which
smoking
is,
gun of innocence?
Of innocence, which is a legal opinion from John Eastman, who's a constitutional scholar, who said, Mr. President, even aside from all the allegations of fraud, what you saw were changes in the rules in the middle of the political process. Only the legislatures in the states can make determinations as to the qualifications of electors under Article 2 of the Constitution. So John Eastman, who's an eminent scholar, gave the president an option, actually several options. What the president said is, I'm going to take the option that asks Mr. Pence to pause the voting so we go back to the contested states and allow the states one last time to make a decision on that.
So, Scott, this is sort of reiterating something that we've already heard from the president in some of his sort of statements that, hey, listen, I was just taking the advice of my lawyers. Eastman, we should note, is one of the possible unindicted co-conspirators that, we read about in the indictment. What are your thoughts on this as a possible defense? My lawyer said it was okay.
Right. Well, we've been expecting this as one of the main defenses that the former president would raise here. So no surprise there. And he's certainly entitled to rely on advice of his own counsel. That said, you don't get to rely on advice of counsel who's advising you to commit a crime. The indictment anticipates this defense by listing several co-conspirators. 5 of them are attorneys. One of them is Mr. Eastman himself. And so what you'll see at trial is that the special counsel put on evidence, starting with the vice president himself saying, I didn't have that power. The idea that I could go in and stop the confirmation, stop the vote, and take account of this false slate of electors is no basis in the law. You'll hear evidence from the prosecutor, from the attorney general, from other advisors telling him that there's no basis for this plan. That, and importantly, combined with the other alleged schemes here, namely setting up false slates of electors from 7 different states, going in and pressuring the people in the 7 different states, the electors themselves and officials, to reverse the legitimate election, and coming up with the overall false narrative that there was election fraud when the president was told, and this is what the evidence the prosecutor will bring in, that in fact there was no election fraud. There was no theft of the election. So the prosecutor's special counsel here has anticipated that by listing these individuals as unindicted co-conspirators. And by doing that, he's essentially saying, look, these lawyers knew the advice they were giving was not justified, was not based on the law, and would potentially lead to the president taking illegal actions.
So let's talk a little bit about the choice not to indict these individuals, but to at least list them, or their descriptions, if you will. Jack Smith made it a point of saying during that press briefing that the investigation is ongoing. Could part of the strategy here be to put pressure on some of these unindicted co-conspirators to cooperate with the investigation?
Yes, it could be part of the strategy. That's common in most cases, but I think the special prosecutor knows that Mr. Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, these guys are not going to flip. They've probably set their course a long time ago. So I think the strategy was that the former president is the person most responsible for what happened here. And in addition, I think the special counsel does not want a multi-defendant case going to trial with the complications you have with 5 or 6 defendants and 6 lawyers sitting there as well. This also means that with just one defendant, the former president, the special counsel has a much better chance of getting this case to trial earlier, because don't forget, the number one defense of the former president is to have this trial take place after the election and to get elected, at which point he or an appointed attorney general can pardon him.
Yeah, we've certainly seen with the classified documents case that when you add additional defendants, then things get extended, the timeline gets extended. Scott Fredericksen, thank you very much.
Happy to do it.